In this video, we'll be discussing the saml bridge. The intention of the saml bridge is to allow federated users to log in to PI-protected content. In order for federated users to log in, first we need to create a concept of an IDP, or an identity provider. Normally, Rumba is the identity provider, but not in all instances. In some instances, Rumba Pi will simply house a record for the identity provider and allow that record to access certain content that Rumba Pi protects. In order to do that, first we need to have a definition of what an identity provider is. That's where the domain creation process occurs. Once a domain is created, it will be linked to the IDP using an external identifier, also known as the external ID. Furthermore, there needs to be an auth URL. We'll get into the explanation for this auth URL later. Once the IDP or domain is created, a user can be associated to that domain using the create user or update user request. Here's a sample block that shows how a user can be associated to a domain. You will normally have a domain ID, which would be the identifier once that domain was created, and a user domain ID, which would be the identifier for that particular user in that domain. It is important to note that this combination is a composite key and therefore is unique, meaning a domain ID of 1 can only have one instance with a user domain ID of 1. So, what does the bridge actually do? How does it work in practicality? In this diagram, you can see that there is a login screen for the user, a menu that the user can click on, CAS, and PI-protected content. What will happen is once the user will log in. Once the user logs in, he will see a menu, and that menu will actually be redirected to CAS. Once he clicks on CAS, he'll see that the IDP identifier, also known as the external IDP ID, will be populated in that link. That link will redirect to CAS, and CAS will see that there is an external IDP ID in here. And once CAS sees that, he will go ahead and redirect him to the saml bridge. What the saml bridge will do is two things. First, it'll send an authn request back to the auth URL, an authentication request, which is just a SAML term or SAML request that will say go ahead and make sure that the user is logged in. Once again, it'll send it to the auth URL that we've provisioned in the domain, and once CAS redirects the user to the auth URL, it is up to the system to redirect back to CAS with an authn response or a SAML response. Once the IDP or system redirects back to CAS with an authn response, CAS will validate it. Once CAS validates it, he's free to redirect the user to the PI-protected content. Let's take a look at a practical example of what that means. We've built out a tool to basically drive this concept home. Without actually having to log in, I can go ahead and set a host name, a service URL, and a domain ID. With that, I can simulate the saml bridge. Please allow me to clear my cookies just to make sure that I don't already have a session established. And I will also open up Firebug so that we can inspect the flow of the bridge. So here's us generating a link. I click on that link, and it should be noted that in this link you can see IDP metadata. The IDP metadata is also known as the external ID for that domain. And let's take a look at a user who will give us a successful redirection of the a successful redirect from the bridge. So this is the authn request that I received from the bridge. And this utility that I'm using is known as mock PowerSchool, or basically a mock IDP. And I can provide an authentication ID, which is also the user domain ID as specified in the contract during user provisioning. And when I come here, this is the this is the response that the IDP would be sending to the SAML bridge. With this response and a valid signature, once I click sign, it'll go ahead and sign it. What this tool will do is it'll send this to the SAML bridge. So I click send, and sure enough, we got redirected to foo.com with a ticket. Now I can do a SAML validate and redeem this ticket with foo.com. And foo.com. And I will see the user and all of his attributes. And that is how the SAML bridge works in a nutshell.